David Cameron has travelled to a war zone and met an embattled president. Cameron met Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky on his first working trip abroad. Does Cameron have a different strategy than his predecessor? To discuss this and a lot more regarding the war, joining me now is Glenn Diesen, a professor of international relations at the University of Southeastern Norway. Welcome to Beyond World is One, Professor.
Thank you.
Right, my first question. This is Cameron's first visit to Ukraine since the war began. How do you compare him to his predecessor?
Well, I don't think there will be much of a difference, to be honest. I think even when he first met now with Zelensky as the foreign secretary, he even made it very clear that that when he, for example, compared himself to Boris Johnson, he was making the argument that, because he was quite critical of his government, but nonetheless he said support for Ukraine was the greatest thing of not just Johnson but also his own predecessors. So I don't think we should expect too much of a difference, as the United Kingdom has put itself largely on this front line now in this proxy war against Russia.
Right. I'm going to quote Cameron at this point: military support for as long as it takes. This is what Cameron said. How realistic is this for the United Kingdom at this point in time of the war?
Well, this is not the United Kingdom of 100 years ago. They have a very limited military, and they have sent a lot of what their own capabilities, which they could afford to send. So I don't think that the UK matters that much. I think the real player you want to look at is the United States. And for the Americans, yeah. I think, so they have sent most of what they could send. You see the fatigue setting in, which they don't want to send in more weapons, and even public opinion has turned against this. And you also see the politicians now seizing on this, in which Ukraine has become a very divisive topic, in which some people say we shouldn't send another dime. So I don't think it matters that much what Cameron says, but in terms of what he stands for, I think, yes, the British will continue to do whatever they can to support Ukraine.
It's a winter of two wars at this point, the war between Israel and Hamas and the war between Russia and Ukraine. How do you think the US will deal with this, given its attention, and where will it focus its attention and also its military donation, so to speak?
Well, this is the problem for the United States. It's often it tends to, still think it lives in the 1990s, where it can pursue the objective of global primacy, where everything is a priority. But as it's discovering, it doesn't have the capacity. And, in terms of going after China, Russia, Iran, and now, supporting Israel, I think it has to set priorities. And in this conflict now, I think it's made very clear that Israel will be its first priority. So even artillery shells, which it had promised to Ukraine, has now been sent to Israel instead. So this priority is quite clear, and this is adds to the problem of Ukraine, which is already suffering greatly in this war of attrition. So it's another layer of a problem for Ukraine.
Right. Speaking of the two wars that are happening in the world right now, the Israel versus Hamas war, Russia versus Ukraine, how does the UK or even the US afford to focus its energy on any particular war? Should it be focusing its energy on the war in Europe and ignore the war in the Middle East, or vice versa?
Well, ideally, we wouldn't have any of these two wars. I think both of these wars could have been avoided. Of course, the war in Ukraine, it's a strange war to focus on, because there's no path to victory. We already see that the attrition rates are heavily in Russia's favor, and they're only growing so, because the Russians, while the Ukrainians have been weakened, the Russians have built up a huge force in the back. They produce a huge amount of arms, ammunition, rockets, drones, and essentially everything. So I think this can't be won. And even if the Americans would be able to defeat Russia on the battleground, it would then likely end in a nuclear war, because Russia could not accept having NATO roll into Ukraine. So one would predict that the US would focus on Israel. But the problem here is also that this war can spiral very quickly out of control, and there's no real political settlement at the moment. Given that they already abandoned the two-state solution, then there's not really anything except ethnic cleansing or apartheid. So there's no other real solution at the moment. What to do with all these millions of Palestinians, which would have to find a way for them to live within a greater Israel, which simply wouldn't work.
Now, has the Israel-Hamas war given Russia an upper hand in its offensive in Ukraine? This is a question that several experts have asked.
No, I think definitely it's been something that's benefited Russia's war fighting, because again, Ukraine doesn't have its own money anymore. It doesn't have its own weaponry. It relies on support from the West. And as the West, as at least the United States, very clearly prioritizes Israel, there's a lot of weapons and political focus and money which would otherwise have gone to Ukraine, which is now being diverted to Israel. So I think this definitely affects the war. And I think that Russia's probably taken advantage of this as well, because they've been stepping up their attacks now all across the front line and begun to advance. So I think they probably see this as a good moment to bring this war to an end through victory. So I think definitely the Russians have taken advantage of the Americans shifting this focus.
Right, absolutely. Time now for a final question, Professor, and I ask this only because the world's attention is currently focused on another war. What will happen once a brutal winter sets in with respect to the Russia-Ukraine war?
Well, it will make war fighting much more difficult. Again, I think they will bring some advantage to Russia, because the war is on Ukrainian territory. So the Russians have built up a huge amount of missiles and drones. So what I would expect over the next 2-3 weeks would be for Russia to begin to attack a lot of the infrastructure, such as power plants, and again, to shut down the Ukrainian military, but also to bring more pain. And again, I think they're looking now to bring this war to an end. So I think the cold weather will make the war much harder, especially in the trenches. And so again, more human suffering to come.
Right, Professor Glenn Diesen, thank you so much for joining us on WION World is One with the latest on the Russia-Ukraine war. Thank you. WION World is One is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news updates on the move.